There are many battleships that are forgotten or otherwise ignored. These are the ships that saw little actual combat and lived quiet lives as a result. After all, big flashy events are what gain attention. However, HMS Centurion is an exception to the rule. Her combat career was nothing to write home about. It was her actions, after she lost her guns, that make her interesting. After all, how often does a battleship get disguised as another battleship? That alone is worth a video. It is, however, close to the end of her story. I will, as always, cover the design and early history of Centurion first. Her life began as the second of the original King George V class battleships. As I covered in my Audacious video, these ships were an incremental improvement on the previous Orion class. As was tradition, while the British focused on getting as many holes into the water as quickly as possible. In the case of Centurion, she was laid down on January 16, 1911, and launched on November 18, 1911. As you can tell, quite fast. Suffice it to say, HMS Dreadnought was not the only example of how fast Britain could build a battleship in those days. That aside, Centurion commissioned into the fleet on May 22, 1913. She did so as an unremarkable member of her class, little different from her sisters. The same 25,000 tons or so on normal loading. The same 10 13.5-inch guns spread out in 5 twin turrets. 2 super-firing on the bow, 2 super-firing on the stern, and 1 amidships right behind the funnels. Her remaining weaponry consisted of 16 4-inch guns, 8 mounted in the forward superstructure, 4 in the aft superstructure, and 4 in hull-mounted casements. These were, in turn, backed up by the standard submerged torpedo tubes. 3 of them in the case of the King George V's, 1 in the stern, and 1 on either broadside. All of this was pushed through the water at a fairly standard 21 knots by 27,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts. For a ship with that heavy a broadside and a 12-inch armor belt, that was perfectly sufficient for the time. With that summarization of her technical details out of the way, though, we can talk service history. For those who like the technical stuff, though, I'll go into much more detail when I cover King George V herself. For now, Centurion. As mentioned, she was commissioned on May 22nd, 1913. The thing is, though, she should have been done much sooner. Her sea trials took place in November 1912. However, shortly after that began, Centurion made it apparent that ramming things is a British battleship tradition. Because on the night of December 9th, Centurion rammed an Italian steamer, the SS Derna, which promptly sank with all hands. Not only was this an unfortunate loss of life, it also caused severe damage to Centurion's bow. Something like 40 feet of her stem was fractured, and her hull frames buckled. Repairs for that would last until March 1913, in addition to reinforcing her hull frames. One can argue the collision at least helped, in that regard, as it identified a weakness in the design. However, beyond that early excitement, nothing major happened to Centurion in the year and a half between her commissioning and the outbreak of the Great War. Or during the Great War, for that matter, but I'll get to that. For the pre-war service, Centurion only had 2 major things of note. On June 24, 1913, she was present when the President of France visited Spithead. And then, alongside her sisters, the battleship represented the Royal Navy at the reopening of the Kiel Canal in June 1914. Soon after that came the July crisis, which saw Centurion join a test mobilization and fleet review in direct response to the crisis. The battleship next moved to Scapa Flow to avoid any sort of surprise attack from the German fleet. If you watch my Audacious video, a lot of this should sound familiar. The King George V class served together, and prior to the unfortunate sinking of Audacious, their careers are pretty similar. Regardless, Centurion did nothing major at first. She left Scapa Flow while the defenses were reinforced. She underwent training and gunnery drills. And indeed, Centurion was sailing with Audacious when her sister struck that mine. Unlike her sister, Centurion avoided any of the undersea weapons. Instead, she returned home. It is here where her story differs from that of Audacious, although not in the most exciting way. The first major action, or at least the first attempt at one, came when the Germans launched their first major raid on the British coast. The raid on Scarborough, Hartlepool, and Whitby in December 1914. This had the potential to see a large fleet action, with Centurion and her surviving sisters part of the British response force. However, this came to nothing. An action by the screening forces of both fleets did occur, but the heavy forces never engaged one another. Centurion returned to port, and to an incredibly quiet 1915. I grant you she did sortie in support of the battlecruisers on January 13, 1915. However, Centurion would not participate in the Battle of Dogger Bank. And following that, it became a standard routine that will become well-trodden as I cover Royal Navy dreadnoughts. A year of refits, patrols, and various training duties. I could cover these, of course, but other than this month the ships did a sweep of the North Sea, or this month she undertook gunnery practice, there's not really much to say. So, instead of that, I'll simply say that 1915 was a quiet year. 1916, on the other hand, was rather more exciting, though it didn't start out that way. The early portion of 1916 was much the same as 1915 had been. Blockade duty, training missions, and the odd attempt at forcing the High Seas Fleet into an engagement. That engagement would come on May 31st, the Battle of Jutland, the grand clash of the dreadnoughts. Unfortunately for Centurion, she would not cover herself in glory here. In point of fact, she only fired 4 salvos, 19 shells in all, at the battlecruiser Lutzo, all of which failed to hit. She took no damage in turn, at least, but that is balanced by being ineffective and hurting the High Seas Fleet. Following this, Centurion saw no further action. There were no more grand battles at sea in the Great War. As such, Centurion spent the rest of the war on the same thing she had been doing in 1915. There was one more chance in April of 1918 for an engagement. I've covered this before, but the Germans attempted to draw out the Grand Fleet by attacking Norwegian convoys. This ultimately came to nothing for a variety of reasons, and the next time Centurion saw the High Seas Fleet, it was at the surrender at Scapa Flow. And thus the Great War ended, and Centurion never saw another chance to use her main guns in anger. In the immediate aftermath of the war, she was present for various operations, such as a prisoner of war exchange with the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War. Other than these minor incidents, however, Centurion spent the first half of the 1920s in reserve. Frankly, she was outdated. And with the Washington Treaty restrictions, the British had to be picky about which old battleships they kept around. This would ultimately see Centurion, in April of 1926, replace Agamemnon as a radio-controlled target ship. The conversion process for that took up until July 1927, at which point she became a punching bag for the Royal Navy. Centurion was converted to diesel fuel and fitted with radio antenna, but otherwise not majorly changed. Until her gun turrets were removed, anyway, at which point her old coal bunkers were stuffed with rocks to maintain her weight. If anything, that increased her draft, as it turned out. However, even this role would prove short-lived. By 1931, Centurion was laid up in reserve, again, as a cost-saving measure. The Great Depression was in full swing. As it would turn out, she only returned to service in 1933 for dive bomber trials, among other target ship duties. Centurion remained in this role, other than repair work, through much of the 1930s. A valuable role, to be sure, just as it was for USS Utah across the Atlantic. But not exactly the most glamorous of roles either. Especially not for a battleship that barely got to fight her intended enemy. This state of affairs would continue until the start of the Second World War. Centurion was, at that point, one of the oldest battleships left to the Royal Navy, technically. She wasn't much of a battleship at that point, mind you, but the British at least half-heartedly considered her for rearming as an anti-aircraft ship in 1940. That was for the Norwegian campaign. Considering how that particular theater chewed up both sides, Centurion is probably lucky that went nowhere. Instead, she was pulled off target duty and served as a repair ship, and then a block ship. Really, that's about the most you could expect out of a disarmed warship of her age. Where things get interesting, though, is in 1941. After her block ship conversion, Centurion was wrapped up in some, let's say, interesting schemes. The first of which being Winston Churchill doing Winston Churchill things. His latest brilliant idea, in this case, being a naval bombardment of the port of Tripoli. This is all fine and good, although it was certainly risky for the Mediterranean fleet. Especially in the early war, when the Italians were very much a going threat. But, still, not inherently a bad idea. Except Churchill wanted the port blocked as well, by sinking a battleship as a block ship. Understandably, Admiral Cunningham was resistant towards using one of his active ships for this role. It would have been wasteful at a time the British couldn't really afford to waste active warships. As such, he suggested Centurion instead. Luckily for her, this ended up going nowhere for several very valid reasons, not least being how difficult it would be to wedge the ship in position, especially when, presumably, under constant air attack. With that plan in the rear-view mirror, as it were, Centurion was used for another role, though exactly when this was done is a bit murky. I've seen 1941 cited as a time frame, but Burt, who is normally pretty good about this, just lists 1939 through 1940. Either way, what happened was interesting and also funny to some extent. The British took Centurion in and began loading her up with fake turrets and superstructure. This was done with the intention of disguising her as HMS Anson, then under construction. The deception here is arguably what Centurion is best known for, with admittedly good reason. The British took an old battleship and used her as a decoy to protect a modern, and far more valuable, battleship. The way they did this is impressive. While yes, you can pick out the oddities if you look, from the air, which is what this was intended for, it's hard to tell. The bridge is smaller and the mast is wrong. There is empty space where there shouldn't be empty space. And yes, she's completely missing the secondary battery. Even so, it's a really well done disguise. Although the funny part is that this is a KGV pretending to be the other KGV. Centurion was a member of the first King George V class. Anson was a member of the second King George V class. It wouldn't have been quite as funny if the British used Iron Duke for this role. Also, it's not the only time the British did this. They did similar in converting a merchant into a decoy for HMS Hermes. In any case, she would keep this design for quite a bit. Burt notes it as sailing 20,000 miles with it in place. However, disguises and blockship duty aside, there wasn't much more for Centurion to do. She never had cause to put that disguise to work in home waters. And her only combat service would come in 1942, when she helped escort a convoy from Alexandria to Malta in June. This would see her attacked by 9 dive bombers, seemingly fooled into thinking she was an active battleship. Must have been quite familiar to Centurion, considering her earlier target ship duty. For their part, the Germans would end up missing her here, with only slight damage from near misses done to the battleship. In turn, Centurion would down one of the bombers with some 20mm cannon she had received for this duty. After this, she did nothing much of note. Even Burt jumps from 1942 straight to 1944. That year, Centurion was assigned to be a breakwater during the invasion of Normandy. Specifically, she was scuttled off Omaha Beach as part of the Mulberry Harbor project. It was, on the one hand, a sad send-off for an old battleship. On the other hand, it was a useful end for a ship that was never going to be used for active duty again. Instead of being scrapped or sunk as a target, Centurion got to help the return to France. That's a good way to go out when you think about it. As for her wreck in the modern day, well, from what I've been able to find, very little would be left. The storm that wrecked the Omaha Mulberry broke her in two, and Centurion was scrapped in place after the war. I wouldn't be surprised if there's scattered bits lying about, but I don't think much is left. That said, I haven't dived Normandy though, so don't 100% quote me on that. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.